In a small county historical society, tucked between rows of archival boxes and forgotten donations, Eker made a discovery that would challenge everything he thought he understood about documentation and memory. He was cataloging items from an estate donation, the final contribution from a family that had once been prominent in the area. The donor had passed away months earlier, leaving behind boxes of photographs, letters, and official papers. Most items were routine: birth announcements, marriage licenses, property deeds. But two objects, placed side by side in the same folder, created an impossible contradiction. The first object was a formal studio portrait. The photograph showed a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, seated in a chair with his hands folded neatly in his lap. His suit was pressed. His collar was starched. His expression was serious but calm, the way children were taught to sit for portraits. The photograph was mounted on thick cardboard, embossed with the name of a local photography studio. On the bottom right corner of the mount, written in careful ink, was a date: 1901. The second object was an official death certificate. The paper was aged but intact, bearing the embossed seal of the county clerk's office. The name on the certificate matched the name written on the back of the photograph. The cause of death was listed as scarlet fever. The age at death was 10 years old. The date of death was clear and unmistakable: 1890. Eker stared at the two items. The boy in the photograph looked alive, healthy, present. Yet according to the official record, he had been dead for 11 years when the portrait was taken. One of these documents had to be wrong: a mislabeled photograph, a clerical error, a mix-up in the family archives. But what if both were authentic? What if the photograph and the death certificate were both telling the truth? He reached out to Franklin, a historian who specialized in early 20th century photography. If anyone could determine whether the portrait was genuine, it would be him. Franklin arrived within days, carrying a magnifying loupe and a small notebook. He worked methodically, examining every detail of the photograph under controlled light. He studied the cardboard mount first, running his fingers along the embossed lettering of the studio name. He checked the edges for signs of tampering or remounting. He examined the surface of the print itself, noting the albumin process, the slight yellowing that occurred naturally with age. Then he turned his attention to the boy. The clothing was critical. Fashions changed quickly in that era, and children's clothing followed strict conventions. Franklin examined the cut of the boy's suit, the style of his collar, the way his hair was parted and combed. He made notes in his book comparing what he saw to known examples from the period. After nearly an hour, he set down his loupe and looked at Eker. The photograph was unquestionably from the period of 1900 to 1905. The studio had operated during those years. The cardboard mount matched other examples from that studio's known work. The albumin print process was consistent with the era. Most importantly, the boy's clothing was entirely wrong for 1890. The style of his suit, the shape of his collar, even the way his hair was cut, all pointed to the turn of the century, not the previous decade. Franklin was certain the photograph could not have been taken in 1890 or earlier. There was one other detail Franklin noted. The boy's eyes were sharp and focused. His posture, while formal, showed slight natural tension in his shoulders, the kind that came from sitting still for the required exposure time. This was not a post-mortem photograph. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, families often photographed their deceased loved ones as a final memorial. Those images had a distinctive quality. The subjects were posed to look peaceful, often with eyes closed or painted onto closed lids. This boy was alive when the photograph was taken. Franklin was sure of it. If the photograph was real, then the death certificate had to be wrong. Eker contacted Kamari, a forensic archivist who worked with historical documents. She specialized in detecting forgeries, alterations, and clerical errors in old records. Kamari arrived with her own set of tools: ultraviolet light, chemical reagents, reference material showing authentic examples of county documents from different decades. She examined the death certificate with the same methodical care Franklin had shown the photograph. She studied the paper stock, comparing its weight and texture to known examples from the 1890s. She analyzed the ink, checking for chemical compositions that matched the period. She scrutinized the handwriting of the county clerk who had filled out the form, comparing letter shapes and pen pressure to other documents he had signed. She examined the embossed seal under magnification, checking for signs it had been lifted from another document or artificially aged. Her conclusion was definitive. The death certificate was authentic. The paper was correct for the period. The ink had aged naturally. The handwriting matched other documents filed by the same clerk in the same year. Most importantly, the embossed seal showed the proper depth and clarity of an original impression, not a reproduction or transfer. The document had been filed and recorded in 1890, exactly as it appeared. Kamari went further. She pulled additional public records to confirm the death certificate's accuracy. The 1880 census listed the family. The father, Marco, was recorded as a merchant. The mother, Spencer, was listed as keeping house. Their son, whose name appeared on both the photograph and the death certificate, was recorded as being born in 1880. He would have been 10 years old in 1890, matching the age at death on the certificate. The 1900 census told a different story. Marco and Spencer were still listed at the same address, but their son was not in the household. No child of any age was recorded as living with them. This absence strongly supported the 1890 death certificate. If the boy had survived, he should have appeared in the 1900 census, 20 years old and likely still living at home or listed nearby. His absence from the record suggested he had indeed died before that census was taken. The conflict was now absolute. The photograph was genuine. The death certificate was genuine. Both pieces of evidence were authentic and accurate for their time. Yet they told contradictory stories about the same person. Eker brought in Julius, a genealogist who specialized in local family histories. If anyone could untangle the family story, it would be him. Julius started with property records and city directories, tracing the family's presence in the community. Marco had been a successful merchant, owning a dry goods store on Main Street. The family had lived in the same house for over 30 years. They were members of the local church. Their name appeared in newspaper announcements and social registers. Julius found a collection of family papers that had been donated to the Historical Society years earlier. Among them were personal letters and a diary kept by Spencer. The diary entries from 1890 were detailed and heartbreaking. She wrote about her son falling ill in late spring. She described the doctor's visits, the prescribed treatments that failed to bring down his fever, the long nights sitting by his bedside. She wrote about the morning he died, the unbearable silence that followed, the funeral arrangements, the burial. The family's own words confirmed the death. Spencer had watched her son die. She had mourned him. She had written about her grief in intimate, private entries never meant for public eyes. There was no reason for her to fabricate such detailed, painful memories in her personal diary. But this confirmation made the photograph even more disturbing. If the boy had died in 1890, who was sitting for that portrait in 1901? Who was wearing that suit, looking directly at the camera with clear, focused eyes? Theories began to emerge. The first was that the family had hired another child to pose as their son. Perhaps they had been unable to accept his death. Perhaps they had wanted to maintain the appearance that he was still alive, to preserve his memory in a tangible form. But this theory raised more questions than it answered. Why would they do such a thing? For whom would they create this illusion? Grief could drive people to unusual actions, but hiring an imposter child to pose for a formal portrait seemed psychologically bizarre. There was no evidence the family had shown the photograph to anyone or used it publicly. The second theory was simpler. Perhaps this was a different boy entirely. A cousin with the same name. another family in the county who happened to share the surname. Julius checked thoroughly. There were no other families with that surname in the county during that period. The photograph had come directly from the family's estate, donated by their last surviving descendant. It had not been mixed in from another source. The third theory involved spirit photography. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, spiritualism was popular. Photographers offered services to create images of the deceased, often using double exposure techniques to make ghosts appear alongside living subjects. Could this be an attempt to capture the dead boy's spirit? Franklin examined the photograph again with this possibility in mind. He was familiar with spirit photographs. They had distinctive characteristics: double exposures, translucent figures, obvious manipulation of the negative. This portrait showed none of those signs. It was a straightforward studio photograph, a single exposure, a solid, physical child sitting in a chair. If this was meant to be a spirit photograph, it was the most realistic, least spiritual example he had ever seen. He ruled out the theory entirely. Every avenue led to a dead end. The evidence was real. The contradiction was absolute. There seemed to be no rational explanation. Julius returned to the public records, frustrated but determined. He had been focusing on death records, trying to find errors or duplicates that might explain the discrepancy. Now he changed his approach. He started searching birth records for the family, specifically looking at entries filed after 1890. The discovery came in the form of a birth certificate dated 1891. The parents were listed as Marco and Spencer, the same couple from the 1880 census and the 1890 death certificate. The child's name, written in the careful hand of the county clerk, was identical to the name on the death certificate. They had given their new son the exact same name as the son who had died just 1 year earlier. Julius stared at the document, understanding dawning. There had been 2 boys, 2 children with the same name, born 11 years apart. The first had died in 1890 at age 10. The second had been born in 1891 and would have been exactly 10 years old in 1901, the year of the photograph. The paradox dissolved. The death certificate from 1890 belonged to the first son. The portrait from 1901 captured the second son, his younger brother, given the same name to replace the child who had been lost. Eaker contacted Khalil, a local historian who specialized in family practices and social customs of the era. The discovery of 2 sons with the same name seemed strange, even disturbing to modern sensibilities, but Khalil explained it was more common than people realized. The practice had a name: replacement child, necronym. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, child mortality rates were staggering. Families expected to lose children to disease, accident, or the complications of infancy: scarlet fever, diphtheria, typhoid, measles. These illnesses swept through communities regularly, taking young lives with them. Parents lived with the constant grinding fear that their children might not survive to adulthood. When a child died, especially a son who carried the family name, parents often responded by giving the same name to the next child born. It was not seen as morbid or unusual. It was a way to process overwhelming grief, a way to continue the family line, a way to ensure the name would not be lost. In some families, it was almost expected. The name belonged to the position in the family, not to the individual child who had held it. Khalil pulled examples from other families in the region. In one family, 3 sons had been given the same name in succession, as the first 2 died in childhood. In another, a daughter's name had been passed to her younger sister after she died from diphtheria. The practice was documented in family Bibles, in church records, in census data. It was not hidden or shameful. It was simply how families coped with loss in an era when loss was constant. Julius re-examined the family letters and diary entries with this new understanding. Spencer's diary entries after 1891 began referring to her son again. She wrote about his first steps, his first words, his growth and development. She never referred to him as her second son or her new son. She simply wrote about her son, using the same name she had used before, as if the child who had died had somehow been returned to her. Marco's business letters occasionally mentioned his son, always using the same name, with no indication there had been two boys who carried it. To outsiders who did not know the family's private history, it would have appeared as though they had one son who had simply grown up over the years. The family never explained the name repetition in their surviving papers. Perhaps it was too painful to discuss directly. Perhaps it seemed unnecessary to explain what everyone in their community would have understood. Perhaps they themselves had come to think of the second son as a continuation of the first, a second chance at the life that had been cut short. The two objects that had started this investigation, the death certificate and the portrait, were not in conflict at all. They were two chapters of the same story. The certificate marked the end of one life. The portrait celebrated the continuation of the name, the family, the hope that this second child would survive where the first had not. Eker arranged the items in the archive carefully. He created a note explaining the discovery, documenting both births, both children, the death of the first and the survival of the second. Future researchers would not face the same confusion he had encountered. The mystery had been solved not by finding an error, but by understanding the context in which these families lived and grieved. Franklin kept a copy of the photograph for his research on period photography. It became an example he used in lectures, a reminder that understanding historical images required understanding the people who created them and the lives they documented. Kamari added the case to her files of unusual archival discoveries. It reinforced her belief that documents must always be examined in context, that apparent contradictions often revealed deeper truths about how people lived and what they valued. Julius completed a full genealogy of the family. The second son, the boy in the 1901 portrait, had survived to adulthood. He married, had children of his own, and continued the family name into the next generation. He lived a long life, dying in the 1960s. His descendants, who had donated the final box of family items to the Historical Society, had never known about his older brother. The story of the first son had been lost to time, remembered only in official records and his mother's private grief. Khalil used the story in his presentations about historical family practices. It became a powerful example of how people in the past were not so different from people today. They loved their children. They mourned their losses. They found ways to carry on in the face of unimaginable pain. The practice of naming children after deceased siblings might seem strange now, but it was born from the same impulse that drives modern parents to keep their children's rooms unchanged, or to speak about them in the present tense. Grief demands expression, and every era finds its own way to give voice to loss. The Historical Society created a small exhibit featuring the photograph and the death certificate, along with the explanation of the two sons. Visitors often stopped at the display, struck by the poignancy of the story. Many recognized similar patterns in their own family trees, repeated names, gaps in records, children who appeared and disappeared from census data. The exhibit became a space for reflection on how much child mortality had shaped the past, how different life was when death was a constant household presence. The story spread beyond the small historical society. Genealogists shared it in their networks as a cautionary tale about making assumptions based on names alone. Photographers referenced it when discussing the importance of dating images accurately. Archivists used it as an example of how documents could tell unexpected stories when examined together rather than in isolation. For Eker, the discovery remained one of the most memorable of his career. He had started with what seemed like an impossible contradiction, a photograph that defied the evidence of death. He had ended with a deeper understanding of how families navigated loss, how they built meaning from tragedy, how they carried their grief forward while still making space for hope and new life. The boy in the portrait had not been a ghost or an impostor or a mistake. He had been a child, born into a family still mourning, given a name heavy with memory and expectation. He had grown up, lived his life, and eventually became part of history himself. His photograph remained, a testament not to mystery or deception, but to the quiet ways families survive the unsurvivable. The two documents, once seemingly at odds, now told a complete story. Death in 1890, birth in 1891, a portrait in 1901, 3 moments in time connected by a name, a family, and the universal human need to hold on to what has been lost while embracing what remains. This is how history hides in plain sight, in the careful records of clerks, in the formal portraits of children, in the private grief of mothers who write in diaries never meant to be read, and in the resilient hope of parents who choose the same name twice, believing that love can outlast loss.